Hi, students. Okay, so I told you that I need you to listen to a little bit of notes on Neo-Freudians, because by the time you get to school on Thursday, you need to know about Carl Jung and his theory, and he's kind of the last of the Neo-Freudians that we talk about. So I know that we all talked about Alfred Adler and the inferiority complex developed in childhood. And remember, the Neo-Freudians still held to the Freudian view that the unconscious is very important. It's what shapes our personality. The childhood and past kind of repression is part of really what we all deal with in later parts of life. So Karen Horney, she talked about this sense of helplessness was started in childhood. Now, Karen Horney is also coming before Erik Erikson, but do you remember Erik Erikson in his very first stage of social development? The first stage for Erikson was trust versus mistrust, and you can see how these two really kind of go together. Karen Horney said that when people feel like this sense of helplessness, it stemmed back from their childhood, because they probably didn't receive that foundation of love and support early on. And so they're always kind of feeling this need of helplessness, and like they needed more and they didn't necessarily get it. She very much rejected Freud's view of penis envy. She said, no, Freud, women do not feel like that way. Whereas he would have looked at it as a sexual tension, Karen Horney would have looked at it as a social tension, and she would have said it's more of a gender difference. It's not really about us women being envious of men because of their genitalia. Karen Horney would have talked about these neurotic needs of like compliance, aggression, withdrawal. And remember, go back again to like the big five. Remember this idea of neuroticism, where like kind of your emotions are up and down, and this idea. Well, Karen Horney would have said like when we have needs that are unfulfilled, then these behaviors kind of show themselves. So again, it's unfulfilled needs. And so this compliance, this idea of you just give in to whatever somebody said, you're very compliant and you're kind of like a pushover, or these aggressive moods, or this kind of withdrawing as well. And so she said that these needs are what shape our personality, and when they are not met, that's what dictates how we behave and think and act and respond. All right, and then Carl Jung. He is maybe one of the most influential. I would say he's probably the most influential. Adler's idea of the inferiority complex is important. I think overall, Jung is probably the most influential of all the Neo-Freudians, all those who worked off Freud's theory but very much rejected Freud as a real theorist. And he talks about the collective unconscious. Now, I really wish we were together in class, because this is an important point to understand, especially for people like me, and maybe it follows for people like you. Jung talks about this collective unconscious that we all have. We all share like universal experiences. As a culture, we all have these kind of universal truths. We all have a need for food, water, shelter, security. We all have these ideas of like, you have to raise children, like you have to take care of children. We all collectively all have these ideas of like life and death, like everybody's going to die. So we share these collective experiences. And really, the reason why we share these collective experiences is because we have these innate characteristics imprinted on us as a result. Like, we don't learn about, say, death maybe in childhood. We just realize it because it's a result of evolution. Like, it's just part of us, and we don't even have to learn it. We've talked about those like innate experiences before. Remember Gibson and Walk, when the baby wouldn't cross that threshold? It's not something they have to be taught, or it's not something that's learned. It's just a result of evolution. Basically, Jung is saying that there are certain characteristics that we just have, and we all have them together. He talked about archetypes, and I gave you a little example of what archetypes are in the kind of tutorial on how you do the assignment. But archetypes are kind of like this idea that you are a character. You become a character in your own story. So if I have the personality and I look at myself as like always having to be like the one who saves the day, I'm always looking at the one who has to like lead and get things done, then I'm gonna look at myself as like the hero of my story. But if I'm going to look at myself of being like the victim, like somebody's always doing me wrong, it's somebody in like who's taking advantage of me, and I always feel like I get like people treating me poorly, then I feel like the victim. Carl Jung talks about archetypes where we become these personalities and they then continue on. And it really doesn't matter what our experiences are or how they kind of could change over time. We interpret them as part of who we are. And though that begins to affect us, not actually the experience or the event, more the personality, how we respond to those. So I really want to give you this idea. I hope you see this graphic. When I first heard about the collective unconscious and this universal experience, I thought about it, and you can even take it with the archetypes. When I first heard about it, it was in relationship to the Holocaust. And I brought this up when we watched Three Identical Strangers. And I brought it up for a very specific purpose because I knew we were going to talk about it later. People who survived the Holocaust have this very real understanding of what it means to be systematically killed because of a reason that is no fault of their own. But people who never survived the Holocaust but are very connected to people who did still feel have the same understanding. Even if you didn't experience it, it's still affecting you today. Do you remember in Three Identical Strangers when the little aunt says, Hetty, when the little aunt says about the boys, and she says, you know, for those of us who lived through the Holocaust, we realize, like, you just don't do things like that. You don't do that to people. I would assume, given her age, she never experienced the Holocaust. She wasn't that old. But her family did. Somebody did, and it was carried on to her through them, and she didn't even have to experience it. Another really good example is slavery. There's a lot of people today who are like, what are you crying about slavery? You've never experienced it. And people are like, I have. I don't have to experience it firsthand to see the destruction it caused, to see the systematic destruction that it caused through the generations. So if you look at that graph there, from 1619 until 1865 in America, slavery is legal. That's, over 200 years, right? Not quite 300 years. That's a long time. Look at how far it took from segregation, from the end of slavery until segregation, until essentially 1954. We're almost 100 years in there, right? Then we're still in this very biased, prejudiced society in the United States. It's only after segregation ended, only after the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s, that there's any more equality. But when people still talk about like the issues that they face because they were discriminated against, and people are like, no, you've never been discriminated against, like you can't. That's not exactly true, because they share a collective unconscious. You don't have to necessarily experience it firsthand to understand what the feelings are. It's a result of being passed down from one generation to the next, and it's kind of imprinted on us. So I just wanted to help you kind of understand this whole idea. Archetypes, we are like a part of ourselves. We are a shadow of ourselves, and this persona that we take on is what is shaping our personality. So I hope that helps. That is the end of the Neo-Freudians. So until next time, see you later. Bye.